Attendant shouts at black teen. Her one call stops the entire airline. Sit down and move to the back, now. The voice cut through the cabin like a whip. Jayla Brooks froze. She was already seated. Seat 3A first class. Window view. Boarding pass tucked inside the front pocket of her hoodie, exactly where she'd been told to keep it. Her backpack rested neatly under the seat in front of her, earbuds still dangling loosely from her ears. She hadn't even gotten a sip of water yet. But the attendant, Cheryl Maddox, her name tag read, was standing over her now, voice raised, jaw tight, like Jayla had just committed a federal offense by being there. "I'm talking to you," Cheryl snapped, hands on hips. Her voice echoed down the aisle, drawing glances from the other passengers who had just begun settling in with their neck pillows and pre-flight drinks. Jayla slowly pulled out her earbuds. "I'm sorry," she said, blinking. "I said this isn't your seat," Cheryl replied sharply. "First class isn't open for reassignments. Now move." Jayla sat still, stunned for a second, then reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out the boarding pass. "This is my seat," she said, her voice calm but unsteady. Cheryl took it from her hand without a word, barely glancing at it. Her lips tightened. She handed it back, then crossed her arms. "You're not supposed to be here. Let's not make this harder than it has to be." Jayla looked around. No one moved. No one said a word. She stood, grabbed her bag, and walked down the aisle past eyes that looked away to a cramped seat near the rear of the plane. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But she took out her phone and sent a single message. She made me move, said I didn't belong. I'm in the back now. 4 hours earlier, the day had started like a victory. Jayla's mom had cried when she dropped her off at the airport, her arms around Jayla like she never wanted to let go. "Your first flight alone," she whispered, brushing her daughter's curls out of her face. "Your Aunt Avery's gonna be so proud." Jayla had just finished a 3-month intensive STEM camp at Stanford. Out of 300 applicants, only 20 had been chosen. She'd ranked in the top 5 with an offer to present her design for a drone flight stabilization system at a youth engineering summit in D.C. She was 17 and headed toward a future her family had never even dared to imagine. Aunt Avery, her mom's college roommate and godmother to Jayla, had surprised her with the first-class ticket just the night before. "You're not flying across the country like cargo," she joked. "You're flying like a boss." Jayla had smiled, not used to all the attention. But it felt good, like she was stepping into a new version of herself. At the gate, she boarded early, showed her ID, her boarding pass, double-checked the gate number, and took her seat. 3A. It felt surreal. Wide armrests, soft lighting, a blanket folded neatly on the side. She'd never flown before. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from joy. She didn't talk to anyone, just stared out the window, watching the runway blink in the distance. Her hands clutched her backpack like it was armor. It carried everything important: her laptop, her sketches, her notes, the tiny notebook her mom had given her filled with motivational quotes. She was already dreaming of the summit, the stage, her voice explaining airflow optimization in a room full of CEOs and engineers, until Cheryl Maddox walked down the aisle and shattered it all. In the back of the plane, Jayla sat silently. The seat felt smaller. The air felt heavier. She placed her bag under the seat and stared out the tiny window. Her chest was tight, but not from nerves, from humiliation. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't resisted. She'd shown her ticket, said her name. Still, she was moved like she was in the wrong. No one had questioned it. Not even her. But now her phone buzzed. What happened? The words hit harder than anything Cheryl had said. Just reading them steadied her breath. Aunt Avery's voice, even in text, was a kind of armor. Jayla typed slowly, told her everything. The words felt strange in her hands, but necessary. There was a pause. Then came the reply. Flight number. Jayla reached into her hoodie, pulled out the now wrinkled boarding pass, and typed in the number. Send. Then silence. She waited. The plane was still boarding. A man grumbled about overhead space. A baby cried in the distance. Cheryl stood near the front, smiling sweetly as she offered orange juice to a couple in suits. Jayla stared ahead. Waiting. The phone buzzed again. Stay where you are. Do not speak to anyone else. I'll handle it. She exhaled, slow and measured. Something in those words shifted the air around her. Aunt Avery wasn't the kind of woman who needed to yell. She didn't send emojis. She didn't threaten. She acted. Jayla sat back, not calm, but centered. Whatever happened next, she would not be alone. Up front, Cheryl sipped from a paper cup, her eyes scanning the cabin like a queen surveying her court. You see that girl? Luis, a younger flight attendant with soft eyes and a kind face, whispered to her as he passed. Cheryl didn't flinch. What about her? She had a real ticket, he said, voice low. I saw it, Cheryl shrugged. Things can be faked. She didn't look right. Something was off. Luis blinked. Off how? Cheryl raised an eyebrow, then looked away. Luis said nothing more. But inside the cockpit, Captain Carter Winslow's phone buzzed. Not a regular call. A direct FAA line, marked urgent. He picked up, listened, then frowned. Copy that, he said. The line disconnected. He sat still for a second, then turned to his co-pilot. Don't push off. Hold the plane. The younger pilot raised an eyebrow. Engines ready. I said hold. Captain Winslow picked up the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to remain at the gate a little longer due to a minor delay. We'll update you shortly. He didn't explain. Didn't have to. But he knew something was coming. He'd flown for 20 years, and he'd never gotten a call from the Director of Aviation Safety herself. He looked down at the name in the system again. Avery Caldwell, and beside it a note he hadn't noticed before. FAA Immediate Oversight, Personal Passenger. He leaned back in his chair and realized this flight wasn't going anywhere, not until someone got answers. Jayla kept her eyes on the seatbelt light overhead, refusing to look around. The economy seat was stiff, tight. She shifted slightly to lean against the window, arms folded, pretending the metal armrest didn't dig into her ribs. Her phone sat in her lap, screen dimmed but not locked. Avery's message was still there, glowing faintly. Stay where you are. Don't speak to anyone else. I'll handle it. Jayla didn't know what that meant exactly. She only knew Avery didn't bluff. Never had. Even as a kid, Jayla had seen how her aunt could calm down her mom's anxiety with one look, settle an argument at a school board meeting with 2 sentences. She was soft-spoken but never unsure. And right now, that steadiness was the only thing holding Jayla together. Up front, Cheryl Maddox moved through the first-class cabin like nothing had happened. She adjusted headrests, smiled at passengers, offered blankets. It was all choreographed, practiced. But there was a tension in her shoulders that wasn't there before. Luis passed her again near row 1, carrying a tray of bottled waters. He didn't stop, but his glance lingered for half a second, just enough to make Cheryl pause. What? She asked. He shook his head. Nothing. She turned away, but not without a flicker of discomfort crossing her face. In the cockpit, Captain Winslow sat with his headset still clipped over one ear, his jaw tight. Another message had just come through from ground control. It wasn't technical. It wasn't routine. It was flagged with an FAA directive code he hadn't seen in over a decade. A formal oversight concern. Level 2 escalation. The name, Avery Caldwell. The directive, remain grounded until further notice. Await compliance contact. He leaned back and ran a hand over his beard. It wasn't just about a late passenger or a broken valve. Something had happened in his cabin, and whatever it was, it just brought the FAA down on his head. "Should I make another announcement?" the co-pilot asked. Winslow shook his head. "Number not yet." In the back of the plane, a woman in a tan blazer tapped her husband's arm. "They were supposed to push back 15 minutes ago," she said, glancing out the window. "Probably just waiting on luggage," the man said without much interest. "No," she murmured, narrowing her eyes. "It's something else." Jayla heard them, but didn't move. Her backpack was still tucked beneath her feet. She opened the front pouch and slowly slid out the small black notebook her mom gave her. On the front was a handwritten sticker, "Speak truth, stay grounded." She hadn't opened it since the end of the STEM camp, but now she flipped through the pages absent-mindedly, anything to keep from looking up and catching someone staring. Across the cabin, 2 rows ahead, a little boy peeked back at her through the gap between the seats. He smiled, innocent. Jayla gave him a small smile in return. His mother gently turned him back around. No one else acknowledged her. Not yet. Back up front, Cheryl paused as she passed seat 3A, the one Jayla had been removed from. She smoothed the blanket, adjusted the headrest. The seat looked exactly like it had before, but somehow it felt louder. She didn't like that. She turned and headed for the galley, where Luis was wiping down counters with a quiet intensity. "You ever think maybe you overstepped?" he asked without looking up. Cheryl bristled. "I followed protocol." "No, you didn't," he replied calmly. "She didn't look like she belonged there," Cheryl snapped, then instantly regretted the words. Luis finally turned to face her, eyes narrowing slightly. "You know who she is?" he asked. Cheryl blinked. "Some girl with a fake pass." Luis exhaled sharply. "You might want to find a seat and start thinking about what you're gonna say when this plane lands." "I said I followed procedure. And I said you didn't." The silence between them thickened. Cheryl's mouth opened, but before she could speak, a soft chime echoed through the cabin, the kind that usually meant a flight update was coming. Only this time there was no announcement. Just silence. Jayla looked up. Across the aisle, other passengers were starting to notice, too. No engine noise, no pushback, no movement. In first class, a businessman checked his watch. "What's the delay?" he muttered to the attendant serving him. "We'll have an update shortly," she replied politely, then walked away. Luis re-entered the galley and pulled Cheryl aside. "They just called again," he said, voice tight. "FAA compliance rep is on their way to the tarmac." Cheryl's expression faltered. "What?" "They're grounding the flight. Not for maintenance, not for weather, for you." Cheryl went pale. This is ridiculous," she said, her voice shaking now. Luis stepped closer. "You need to get ahead of this," he said quietly. "You made her move without scanning her pass, without checking the manifest, just because of how she looked. I didn't know." "You didn't ask." Cheryl turned away, heart pounding. Out on the tarmac, a dark SUV had pulled up beside the terminal. Inside, 2 FAA compliance officers were preparing to board. Jayla couldn't see any of this from her window, but she felt the shift. The energy in the cabin had changed. What was once casual quiet had turned into a loaded silence. One passenger up front tried to flag down an attendant, but no one came. People were beginning to wonder. Something was off, and Cheryl, standing behind the curtain in the galley, finally understood what it felt like to be the one everyone was watching. She closed her eyes and gripped the edge of the counter. Luis leaned against the wall beside her. "This isn't going away," he said, voice low. "She didn't yell. She didn't fight, and still, you're the one they're coming for." At the back of the plane, Jayla glanced down at her phone one last time. A new message lit up. "They're boarding now. Just stay where you are." And she did, not just because she trusted Avery, but because somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the ache and the fury, she knew this wasn't just about a seat. This was about being seen, about being heard. And for the first time since she'd been told to move, she didn't feel small. She felt ready. The engines never started. 25 minutes had passed since Jayla was sent to the back of the plane. The air inside the cabin had shifted from warm and expectant to tense and hushed. Conversations that had been light and casual earlier now hung suspended, interrupted by glances at watches, quiet sighs, and impatient throat clears. Still, no one moved. Still, the plane remained parked at the gate. Jayla stayed motionless in her seat, her phone resting face down on her tray table. She hadn't opened it since the last message. "They're boarding now. Just stay where you are." She did. The window beside her framed a stretch of empty tarmac. Then, just beyond the edge of her view, a black SUV rolled slowly up to the gate. She couldn't see the markings on the side, but the tension in the crew had already told her enough. At the front of the plane, the intercom crackled to life. "This is your captain," Winslow's voice said, calm but clipped. "We've been advised by ground control to continue holding at the gate. We appreciate your patience." He didn't give a reason. He didn't need to. In the galley, Cheryl stood still as a statue, one hand wrapped tight around the handle of a coffee pot she wasn't pouring. Her thoughts raced. She kept replaying it. Jayla's face, the ticket, the way she dismissed her without a second glance. She hadn't meant anything by it, she told herself, but she knew, deep down, that wasn't true. Louis stood nearby, arms crossed, watching her with something between disappointment and disbelief. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said softly. Cheryl flinched. "I made a call. That's what we're trained to do." "No," he said, stepping forward. "You made a judgment. Not a call. Not a check. A snap judgment. Based on nothing but a look. She was a teenager. And she was alone." It didn't feel right. Luis's voice dropped. "You mean she didn't look like the kind of girl who gets to sit in first class?" Cheryl didn't answer. She stared at the pot like it might help her disappear. Then a soft knock came from the front of the plane. The door cracked open. Captain Winslow turned from his seat as the lead ground officer stepped in, followed by a tall woman in a Navy FAA jacket. Her badge gleamed against her lapel. Her name tag read, "Special Investigator Claire Rhodes." She was followed by a second figure, an older man in a dark gray suit with a tablet in hand. They didn't speak to anyone. They walked past first class, past business, and straight toward the galley. Cheryl saw them and took a shaky step back. I wasn't told they were already here." Louis stepped aside, offering nothing. Investigator Rhodes stopped in front of her, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. "Miss Cheryl Maddox?" Cheryl nodded, voice barely audible. "Yes. I'm with the FAA Compliance Office. We've received a report regarding passenger mistreatment. You'll be asked to exit the aircraft immediately and accompany us to an on-site investigation room." Cheryl's eyes widened. There must be some mistake. The passenger in question was assigned a first-class seat, had a valid boarding pass, and was removed without verification. Is that correct? I didn't think. That's not what I asked." Cheryl opened her mouth, closed it. Her fingers tightened around the metal coffee pot. "Please gather your belongings. You'll be escorted off the plane." As she stepped forward, the second agent leaned in and added, "We recommend you not speak further with crew or passengers. Anything you say may be entered into the incident record." Louise watched in silence as she slowly walked toward the front, her posture stiff, her gaze fixed on the floor. Jayla didn't know what was happening up front until she heard the footsteps. She looked up just in time to see Cheryl being led down the aisle, her expression a pale shadow of the woman who had raised her voice earlier. Passengers turned their heads, startled. A few leaned out of their rows to get a better look. Jayla didn't move, but Cheryl did pause, for a second, as she passed. Their eyes met. There was no fury in Jayla's expression, no gloating, just a quiet, unshakable calm. The kind that says, "You didn't break me." Cheryl broke eye contact first and walked on. As the cabin door shut again, murmurs spread through the plane like wildfire. One woman whispered to her husband, "Was that the same one who yelled at that girl earlier?" Another leaned toward a colleague. "They pulled her off the flight. FAA. That's serious." Even the man in 3B, who had earlier asked for his seat to be cleaned again, looked unsettled now. Back in the cockpit, Captain Winslow received the final confirmation. They were clear to taxi, but not yet cleared for takeoff. Not until a full incident record was established, not until the FAA finished their interviews. He rubbed his temple and turned to his co-pilot. "This isn't just about a seat anymore. This is about the whole damn system." And he was right. Down in the terminal, Cheryl sat inside a cold gray room with 2 agents and a digital recorder on the table. She was still in uniform, but it felt more like a costume now. The stripes on her sleeves no longer gave her authority, only exposure. "Please describe the moment you decided to remove the passenger from her seat," Rhodes asked. "I thought it was a mistake," Cheryl said quickly. "Based on?" Cheryl swallowed. She was a teenager. Alone. She looked nervous. I'd never seen her name before. "Did you verify her ticket?" "I looked at it." "Did you scan it? Confirm with the manifest? Speak to ground crew?" Cheryl didn't answer. The silence stretched. When Rhodes finally spoke again, her voice was cold and even. "Miss Maddox, what you did today wasn't procedure. It was prejudice. And this time, the system you thought would protect you is watching." Cheryl looked down at her hands. For the first time, she couldn't find a version of the story that made her the hero. And up in seat 30A, Jayla leaned back and exhaled. She didn't feel victorious. She felt visible. And for now, that was enough. Captain Winslow hadn't left his seat for the last hour. He kept his eyes on the instrument panel, fingers tapping against the throttle levers that weren't going anywhere. The plane was still grounded. Technically, they could have taxied 20 minutes ago, but the clearance from FAA wasn't coming through. Not until certain steps were completed. Avery Caldwell's name was still flashing in the message log. Federal Aviation Administration Director of Aviation Safety. He'd flown high-profile passengers before. Actors, state senators, even a foreign prime minister once. But no one had frozen an entire flight like this. Back in the terminal, a storm was building. Jayla had stayed quiet through it all. Even when passengers began murmuring, even when a few of them started looking her way, she said nothing. She sat in seat 30A with her hands in her lap, head tilted against the cabin wall, the soft drone of whispers rising around her. A woman across the aisle finally broke the spell. "You all right, sweetheart?" she asked, voice gentle, eyes soft with worry. Jayla turned slowly and nodded. "I'm fine. You didn't do anything wrong, did you?" "No," Jayla said simply. The woman hesitated, then leaned in a little closer. "Then why'd they move you?" Jayla blinked, then shrugged. "You'd have to ask her." "Her's not on the plane anymore," the woman whispered. "They escorted her off." Jayla looked forward again, not responding. The woman didn't press. She understood something important in that moment. Some truths aren't meant to be explained by the one who lived them. In the cockpit, another notification came through. FAA agents had requested an immediate review of the passenger manifest and the internal cabin footage. Winslow sighed and turned to his co-pilot. They're treating this like a Category 2 breach. Of what? Discrimination protocol. In-flight passenger mistreatment. The co-pilot raised his brows. That's real? Yeah, Winslow muttered. And it's rare. He paused, then added, I've been flying for 23 years. I've never seen a compliance team move this fast. Back in the galley, Luis was collecting stray cups from business class when the forward intercom chimed again. This time it wasn't the captain. It was ground dispatch. Luis picked it up. Yes, this is Luis. FAA is issuing a cabin-wide incident report, the voice on the other end said. They want written statements from all flight crew and any passengers who witnessed the confrontation. Luis blinked. All of us? Immediately after landing. And the girl, she's to be last off the plane. Luis didn't say anything. He hung up and glanced toward the back of the cabin where Jayla sat, quiet and unshaken. This girl, this teenager, had turned the plane into a courtroom, and no one had even heard her raise her voice. In a private conference room inside the terminal, Cheryl Maddox sat pale-faced across from 3 FAA investigators. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, her hair now pulled back in a tight, uncomfortable knot. The badge pinned to her uniform looked less like a symbol of authority and more like an anchor. Did the passenger argue? Rhodes asked. No, Cheryl said. Did she threaten, yell, use any kind of inappropriate language? No, Rhodes leaned forward. Then why did you remove her? Cheryl's throat tightened. She didn't match the profile. A long silence filled the room. You mean she didn't look like someone who flies first class, the second agent said flatly. Cheryl looked down. I thought she was in the wrong seat. That's all. No, Rhodes said. That's not all. You saw her ticket. You made a decision based on how she looked, and that's not policy, that's bias. Cheryl didn't respond, because there was nothing she could say. Back on the plane, word was spreading quietly. The whisper network had ignited. Passengers began to put the pieces together, why they hadn't taken off, why an attendant had been removed, why FAA officers had walked on and off with stone faces and tablets in hand. One of the men in business class turned to the woman beside him. You think it's really because of the girl? She didn't do anything, the woman replied, her voice low. But I saw the way the attendant talked to her, loud, condescending. It was uncomfortable. You didn't say anything. Neither did you. That silence, that collective stillness that had allowed it to happen, was now turning on them all. No one had stood up. No one had questioned it. And now they were all part of the aftermath. In seat 30A, Jayla flipped through her notebook again. On page 7 was something she'd written weeks ago during camp. When people question your place, don't lower your voice. Lower theirs with your presence. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't pushed back. But still, she'd been heard. A few minutes later, the cockpit door opened, and Captain Winslow stepped into the cabin for the first time since boarding. Every head turned. He didn't say much, just walked slowly down the aisle toward the back. When he reached Jayla's row, he stopped. Miss Brooks? She looked up. Yes? I just wanted you to know. He hesitated, then took a breath. You handled yourself with grace today. I'm sorry for what happened. Jayla nodded once, slowly. Thank you, Captain. He didn't linger, just gave a small nod and walked back to the front. Luis, who had watched the entire exchange from the galley, turned to the older flight attendant beside him. You ever seen a flight go this quiet? She shook her head. Not in 30 years. Luis looked out toward the window again. They're not gonna forget her. No, she said quietly. They shouldn't. The plane still hadn't moved, Passengers had stopped pretending they weren't curious. A few had begun whispering openly now, their voices rising above the white noise hum of the cabin. One man even stood up to look out the window, searching for an explanation. He saw nothing unusual, no refueling truck, no luggage carts, no thunderclouds. Just a black SUV that hadn't moved in over an hour and ground crew standing around it like they'd been told to stay out of the way. Jayla sat quietly, her back straight, fingers loosely clasped in her lap. Her posture hadn't changed, but everything else had. The weight in the cabin, the silence, the subtle shift in how people looked at her now, not as an afterthought, not as someone out of place, but with a kind of caution, a kind of awareness. It was uncomfortable, but it was better than invisibility. Luis walked slowly down the aisle with a tray of water bottles. As he passed her row, he paused. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly, "can I get you anything?" Jayla looked up. There was no forced smile on his face, no fake cheeriness, just respect. She shook her head. "I'm okay, thank you." He gave her a small nod and continued on, but not before casting a sharp glance at the other attendants up front. There was something different in his walk now, less dutiful, more purposeful. He'd made up his mind about where he stood. At the front of the plane, in the galley, another flight attendant, Marianne, was furiously texting her sister in Houston. Something went down. FAA came on board, took Cheryl off. Whole planes still grounded. Girl in economies at the center of it. I think she's FAA connected or something. Never seen anything like this. Inside the FAA's temporary holding room in the terminal, Cheryl was unraveling. Jayla remained seated. She didn't flinch, didn't turn her head. Her phone sat screen down beside her water bottle, unread messages piling up. She didn't need to read them to know what was happening now. She could feel it in the air. In first class, a passenger in a navy blue suit stood up, but a flight attendant motioned for him to stay seated. "Please remain where you are," she said calmly. "We'll begin exiting by row shortly." "Are we even flying today?" he asked. "No, sir. This flight has been cancelled. You'll be rebooked at the gate." "What the hell is going on?" She didn't answer, but as the uniformed FAA representative stepped forward and asked for passengers in rows 1 through 5 to prepare their statements, people started realizing this wasn't about weather or maintenance. This was a federal investigation. Jayla kept her eyes ahead. Her body didn't move, but her chest tightened as the hush in the cabin thickened again. She'd never asked for this, never wanted to become a symbol. All she wanted was to sit in her seat, fly across the country, and speak at a summit her entire community had rooted her toward. But now she was more than a student, more than a passenger. She was evidence, she was precedent, she was change unfolding in real time. Luis leaned into the galley where the flight lead and another attendant sat on the jump seats, pale and quiet. "They just canceled the flight," he said. "They're not letting us leave either. Everyone's getting interviewed on site." Marianne looked up slowly. "Do we know if they're pressing charges?" Luis shook his head. "They're gathering statements. But Cheryl's done. That's a career ender." He didn't say it out loud, but they all knew the truth. Cheryl hadn't just crossed a line. She'd made the entire system answer for it. And it wasn't over. Near the front, Captain Winslow stood outside the cockpit, arms crossed, eyes locked on the team moving through his aircraft. He'd seen passengers removed before. Drunk, belligerent, violent. But never this. Never a teenage girl. Never someone who'd simply sat in the seat she was assigned, and never a response like this one. Avery Caldwell's name still echoed in his mind. Back in the terminal, Cheryl sat inside a sterile white interview room, her uniform unzipped halfway, the navy collar crumpled like the resolve in her voice. Across from her, FAA compliance officer Claire Rhodes flipped through a growing file of notes. We've now spoken to 4 passengers who overheard the confrontation, Rhodes said without looking up. All of them confirmed your tone was aggressive. None recall you checking her ticket with a scanner. I didn't raise my voice, Cheryl said quickly. Rhodes set her pen down. Let me be clear. You raised your authority, and you did it selectively. You asked no other passenger in first class to verify their boarding pass. You only challenged her. Why? I told you I didn't recognize her name. Rhodes leaned back. That's not policy, and it's not protection. It's profiling. Cheryl looked down at her lap. Her fingers trembled, still grasping the last shreds of the certainty she thought her uniform once gave her. The agency will proceed with disciplinary recommendations, Rhodes continued. Until then, you are suspended without pay, and your access to active rosters is revoked. Cheryl didn't cry. She didn't argue. But inside, something cracked open, a hollow space where her years of seniority used to live. She had spent a decade telling herself she kept order. Today proved otherwise. On the plane, passengers began to deboard. Row by row, they gathered their belongings and stepped off without a word. Most avoided eye contact with Jayla as they passed. Some glanced at her, a few with quiet guilt, 1 or 2 with fleeting recognition. A woman with short silver hair paused beside her row. She didn't say anything, but she looked at Jayla directly. And for the first time, someone held the gaze. It lasted just a moment, but it said what words could not. I saw what happened. I didn't speak up. I'm sorry. Jayla blinked and nodded faintly. Then the woman walked on. Luis returned, now without his service cart. He crouched slightly beside her row, careful not to draw too much attention. You'll be the last one out, he said gently. They're waiting for you in the jet bridge. Jayla looked at him. Is it over? He shook his head. Not even close, but you did something today. You know that, right? Jayla didn't respond right away. Then softly, I didn't do anything. Luis smiled faintly. Exactly. He stood and moved to the next row. The cabin was almost empty now. Jayla sat alone, the echoes of silence and shame and consequence still stitched into every aisle. Then her phone buzzed. Avery. They're ready. Take your time. Then walk out proud. Jayla closed her notebook, took one slow breath, and reached for her backpack. She stood up, looked around one last time. Same plane, same seat. But it didn't feel small anymore. She did, however, feel seen. And that was new. Jayla stepped into the jet bridge slowly, not because she was afraid, but because she understood the weight of that moment. 2 federal officers were waiting just past the threshold, flanked by a tall woman in a charcoal blazer, FAA Deputy Director Linda Mercer. Cameras weren't allowed in that corridor, but Jayla could feel the invisible lens of public attention trailing her every movement. She'd left the plane last, just as instructed. Not out of punishment, but out of protocol. Because this was no longer just a flight. It was a federal case. Luis had been right. It wasn't over. Mercer extended her hand. Miss Brooks, she said, thank you for your cooperation. Jayla nodded politely, gripping her backpack tighter on her shoulder. She didn't speak. We won't be asking you questions today, Mercer continued. But you'll be contacted formally within the week. The agency will be recommending systemic changes as a result of this incident. You should be proud of how you handled yourself. Jayla blinked, absorbing that. She didn't feel proud. She felt tired, drained in a way that didn't show on her face. She just nodded again. Behind them, the black SUV that had been parked outside the terminal all afternoon now pulled around to the service exit. Inside it, Avery Caldwell was waiting. Jayla stepped into the back seat and the door closed with a quiet click. The moment she sat down, the tightness in her chest finally gave way. Avery didn't say anything right away. She just looked over, scanned Jayla's face like she was searching for a fracture. When she didn't find one, she let out a breath. "You did everything right." Jayla looked out the window. "I didn't even do anything." That's exactly what made it powerful. They drove in silence for a moment. Then Jayla asked, "What happens to her?" The flight attendant. "She's suspended," Avery replied. "There's a formal investigation pending, but she won't be flying again anytime soon, and the airline is scrambling. Because of me? Because of the truth?" Jayla pressed her forehead lightly against the cool glass. "She didn't even yell at anyone else. Just me. She didn't have to yell. She dismissed you, and everyone let her." Jayla didn't speak again. She didn't need to. The following morning, the story broke in full. An anonymous leak from inside the airline revealed the flight number, the name of the removed attendant, and the internal FAA memo that had triggered the investigation. Within hours, Flight 263 was trending on social media. So was number Jayla Brooks. Most people didn't know her story. They only knew a single moment. Cell phone footage of a black teen quietly returning to her seat while a white flight attendant stood frozen nearby, face pale, surrounded by federal officers. But that was enough. Talk shows picked it up. Civil rights groups issued statements. Airline stock dipped by 2 points by mid-afternoon. In a private boardroom inside the airline's headquarters, executives sat pale-faced around a glass table. Legal counsel read from a thick folder of witness statements. No other passengers were asked for their boarding passes. No verbal confirmation from ground crew. No manifest cross-check. She was targeted. It's a textbook case. The CEO didn't speak. He just tapped his pen against the table. "What's our exposure?" "Widespread," the legal director replied. "And not just in media. FAA will be demanding operational changes, maybe even federal oversight for a quarter. If this goes public in the wrong way, we're looking at boycotts, class action, government sanctions." The head of PR cleared her throat. "There's one path forward, a public apology, a direct statement to the passenger involved, and a full-scale overhaul of internal flight crew training." "Will she talk to us?" the CEO asked. "She hasn't spoken to anyone yet," the PR rep said, "but we should assume she won't. She doesn't seem to want the spotlight." They were right. Jayla hadn't posted anything. She hadn't given a single interview. While the world argued about her, speculated, praised, condemned, theorized, she sat curled on a couch in her aunt's living room, scrolling through news she hadn't asked to be part of. She turned to Avery. "I didn't want this." "You didn't ask for it," Avery corrected. "There's a difference. I don't want to be the reason people change." "You're not," Avery said. "You're the reason they have to." The next day, FAA held a press conference. No names were used, but policies were announced. Every major airline would now be subject to mandatory quarterly discrimination audits. A new reporting platform was being developed to allow passengers to file bias complaints in real time. And a pilot program, first of its kind, would allow young travelers to register as protected flyers if they were minors traveling alone. Jayla watched the coverage from the kitchen table, her fingers curled around a mug of tea. Avery walked past, dropping a thick envelope onto the table. "What's this?" "Formal letter from the FAA," Avery said. "You're being commended, quietly, but officially." Jayla opened it. Inside, in neat black type, were the words, "To Miss Jayla Brooks, for your calm, courage, and quiet strength. You reminded us what accountability looks like, not with noise, but with presence." Jayla smiled for the first time in days. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. But it was real. 3 weeks after Flight 263 was grounded, the airline released a public statement. It was short, tightly edited, and had clearly gone through too many hands to feel personal. But it acknowledged wrongdoing. It confirmed Cheryl Maddox's permanent removal from service. It announced mandatory bias training across all domestic routes, plus a new passenger protection policy, internally referred to as the Brooks Protocol. Jayla read the statement from her phone while sitting in the back of her classroom. Her physics teacher was late, and the room buzzed with quiet conversation, but her world felt muted. Her name wasn't mentioned in the release, but she didn't need it to be. The change was real. She opened a text from Avery. It's official. FAA is rolling out your protocol across 5 major airlines. That means thousands of crew will be retrained. Not because of who you are, but because of what you stood for. Jayla replied with a simple, "Good." Then she tucked the phone away and stared out the window. The sky looked different now. It wasn't just a place to travel through. It was a place that had once tried to shrink her and failed. The following month, her school invited her to speak at an assembly. She almost turned it down, but Avery reminded her, "Silence protects comfort, but your voice makes people look." So Jayla stood on stage in a simple gray hoodie and jeans, her hands tucked into her pockets, staring out at hundreds of faces, some curious, some admiring, others trying to figure out how someone so quiet could have grounded an entire plane. She cleared her throat. "I didn't raise my voice that day," she said. "I didn't fight, I didn't even speak until I had to. But I knew I was being watched. And more than that, I knew I was being judged for something I never chose. My skin, my age, my place on a plane." She paused. "And I'm not here to tell you that power always works fast. It doesn't. But sometimes it listens when you speak with clarity, when you don't apologize for taking up space." The auditorium stayed still, not out of boredom, out of attention. Afterward, one of the younger girls from the freshman class approached her near the exit doors. "Hey," the girl whispered, eyes wide. "Do you think I could do what you did?" Jayla smiled. "You don't have to wait for someone to shove you out of your seat to prove you belong in it." That night, as Jayla sat curled up on the couch, sipping hot chocolate with Avery nearby, a news anchor's voice played softly in the background. And though Miss Brooks has declined interviews, her impact continues to ripple through the aviation industry. Policies are changing, conversations are shifting, and passengers are watching. Avery muted the TV. "You good with all this?" she asked, not looking over. Jayla nodded. "I didn't do it for any of that. I just wanted to sit in peace." "And now?" Avery asked. Jayla leaned her head back and whispered, "Now I want to make sure no one else gets pushed out of peace just because they don't look right." Outside, a plane rumbled across the night sky, low and steady. Its lights blinked like quiet assurance across the clouds. Back at the airline's training center, a new video played for every incoming flight attendant. It wasn't flashy, no dramatic music, no corporate slogans. Just a recreation of a single flight, a single seat, a single choice. And at the end of the video, white letters appeared across a black screen. "Respect is not a privilege. It's a right. And no one should have to earn it mid-air." Jayla never sought to change the system. She just refused to shrink inside it. And somehow, that was enough. So, to everyone who's ever been told they didn't belong, to everyone who's been questioned before they were greeted, this story is for you. Sometimes you don't need to shout. Sometimes you just need to stay seated. Because the truth, it travels farther than you think. If this story moved you, if it made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful, true-to-life stories that matter. Let's keep giving voice to the ones who've been silenced.